All right, I'm Peter Gabel, and I'm going to be reading my book, The Desire for Mutual Recognition, Social Movements, and the Dissolution of the False Self. And because I'll be trying to capture the experience of actually existing, of living our lives from the inside, as we experience the world moment to moment, I may repeat certain phrases or go back over certain sentences to try and bring out the feeling that's supposed to be in them, because the whole point of the book is to capture how things feel as we actually live them, rather than to talk about the world from a kind of detached standpoint. And so if I read something and I don't feel I've captured it, I may just read it again. So I'll do that occasionally as we go through the book together. So here we go. The Desire for Mutual Recognition, Social Movements, and the Dissolution of the False Self. So, the preface. If you were to sit opposite me here in my living room, and if we sat together quietly for perhaps a few minutes, we might quite suddenly become present to each other, or more accurately, discover a mutuality of presence that was already here, but was masked by ourselves, these outer garments of personality that we have been wearing without realizing it, to separate us. In that moment, we would experience ourselves not as individuals with two separate centers of being, but as social beings already connected by a spiritual bond that unites us. From the relatively withdrawn detachment of everyday life, we would quite suddenly find ourselves pulled into the immediacy of co-presence, meeting like a Holy Spirit in front of the seemingly separate beings we had been but a moment earlier. And such a meeting, if it were to occur, would lead us to see, however briefly, that we are all actually co-present to each other in just this way. That we are not lost in our heads and our personalities and selves, but are truly united in a living lattice work of interbeing, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied together in a single garment of destiny, to quote Martin Luther King Jr., whose ground is love itself. I am he, as you are she, as you are me, and we are all together. This book seeks to illuminate both the immediate and present truth of this mutuality of presence and its potential to become visible through mutual recognition, and also the legacy of fear of the other that routinely disables us from seeing one another as the scattered, shattered shards of light seeking reunification that we actually are. I hope that the book will contribute to the emerging movement that is insisting that attending to the spiritual dimension of our social existence is an essential part of transforming the world, that we cannot accomplish this transformation by remaining tied to the inherited paradigms of social theory and action that focus only on the material external aspects of life. Marxism, psychoanalysis, feminism, deconstruction, queer theory, identity politics, and environmentalism have all made important contributions to understanding what is wrong with the world. But a new pathway of thought and action is needed to illuminate the social spiritual distortions that keep reproducing the conditions of separation that create so much human suffering. If 20,000 children die of starvation each day, and if we have sufficient food to feed them, then it is morally required that we discover the reason that we are not doing so. We are not experiencing the spiritual bond that unites us to each other and through each other to each of these children. I hope this book succeeds in showing why this is so and how a new kind of social spiritual activism can begin to heal the fear at the heart of being that continues to hold us back. I first developed the central ideas put forward in the first few chapters of this book in my doctoral dissertation in psychology, written at the Wright Institute in Berkeley almost 40 years ago. In the subsequent decades, I have written many articles and law reviews and in Tikkun magazine, of which I have long been an editor. And I have published some of my writings in my two previous books, The Bank Teller and Other Essays on the Politics of Meaning, and Another Way of Seeing, Essays on Transforming Law, Politics, and Culture. Much of this work has been based on the ideas originally formulated, at least in outline, in that early dissertation. But I have never sought again to write down the entire theory in one place in a single text. While much of the core of the first two chapters of this book expresses ideas first appearing in my dissertation, I could not have written chapters 3 through 10 without having lived the intervening decades and learned slowly how the fear of the other that we first internalize in childhood is linked to the fear circulating from one to the other in the wider world, including within our own movements for social change. So in some respects, it is better to have waited this long to publish these ideas. I'll hope with Hegel that the owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk. True mutual recognition of each other's full and vulnerable humanity, if we could begin to more fully realize it in the world, would begin to dissolve the false self that keeps us sealed off from one another, and would allow us to move more decisively toward the moral redemption of the loving impulse that is already at the heart of our social existence. That loving impulse is expressed most palpably in the mutuality of presence that emerges in idealistic social movements. But its expression remains possible in every human encounter and points in every such encounter toward the possibility of the completion of our social being through one another that we have aspired to from birth and that we carry within us as a longing in our hearts as long as we are here. I hope that this book contributes to making that possibility more visible, and by doing so increases our confidence that it can become so in reality. Introduction. We are born as living beings and emerge into direct experiential contact with the world. But almost immediately an envelope is cast over us. This envelope is often referred to as our conditioning, and in truth we begin to sense it sometime before birth, in the mood that surrounds us even prenatally. This mood almost always transmits love. Our mothers carrying and later holding us, the joy and affection that spontaneously flows from others toward, around, and through us, a true circuit of radiant social humanity. But it also transmits the limitations on love that have been inherited from prior generations, as these limitations are manifested in the world of our parents. Thus, each of us exists as a plenitude of being miraculously bursting into the world at a particular time and place. Wow, incredible. And yet, because we are inherently social creatures, we are right away folded into a social embrace that envelops us in a blend of love and doubt that establishes from the very start the psycho-spiritual field within which we must exist ourselves forward and thus make our journey. In this book, I present as best I can in written words my sense of how this process of existing ourselves forward as social beings inmixed in an ambivalent psycho-spiritual field actually occurs, with the hope of supporting the love side of the equation, of moving us forward toward the realization of a fully loving social world that will be the full realization of ourselves as loving beings. The point is to build a world in which we can reciprocate what we ourselves long for, to respond with a loving embrace as a society to the core loving impulse that pulses through each of us. Surely this is doable. A main problem that inhibits our ability to move forward toward this more loving and caring world is that the cultural envelope into which we have been cast from our earliest days assimilates us to a way of seeing and a way of thinking that prevents us from apprehending the world as it actually is, as an existential intersubjective terrain in which we are perpetually struggling to make authentic contact with the other, with others, and are discouraged by a rotating fear that our longing will not be realized. We cannot easily see this terrain, this psycho-spiritual field in perpetual motion inflected by desire and fear, because the fearful aspect of this field has led us, through our conditioning from our earliest years, to perceive ourselves as separated entities, abstract individuals, scattered within an abstract entity called society. When we do so perceive the world, we actually unconsciously withdraw ourselves back from the immediacy of our existential enmeshment in the world to an imaginary mental space in which we look at the world from a protective distance. From this outside position, we then think about the world as an entity outside us, but in which we also are as one of the people in it within the mental entity. Once our immediate presence has been erased in this way, through withdrawal back and up into the head, so to speak, we then participate in the conditioned way of conceiving of the world, which since the Enlightenment of the 16th and 17th centuries has roughly involved the use of mental concepts or word forms transmitted initially through speech sounds that signify a mental picture made up of scattered individuals and the state and other entities, all presupposing our essential ontological separation. We're all individuals in this society. That's just a mental concept or picture. That's not our here reality, our presence to each other as we live it. Thus, when the existential world is in its normal inert state, held in place by our fear of each other through dynamics I will discuss in this book, our way of seeing the world and thinking about the world reflects this fear and unconsciously seeks to cement the inert state through withdrawn perception and conceptual representations carrying images that convey, defend, and legitimize it. In reality, I am here in a room with you, in the present moment, in what I am calling an intersubjective psychospiritual field of desire and fear or doubt, perhaps of tentative mutual presence, as are all others who are not outdoors across the geological landscape stretching from coast to coast. We're all just in rooms together. That's the reality, unless we're outside. We're not in society. We're in rooms together. But instead of seeing this horizontal existential reality, we may think, I am a citizen of the United States, an individual among 350 million other individuals living in a democracy started by our founding fathers and encoded in our Constitution and legal system. While this latter statement is true enough if understood as a provisional and culturally specific way of seeing and describing the existentially grounded world of our actual world, the world of people in rooms, if we are not outdoors, aspiring to authentic connection and fearing it at the same time. It is not true if it is reified or treated as a fact so as to obscure the visibility of our being together in rooms. In other words, if we're going around thinking, without even realizing, I'm a citizen of the United States that was founded by the founding fathers and so forth and so on, and there's the state, and I'm one of the citizens in the society. If that mental concept about reality masks that we are here together in the room, in fact, right now we are. I'm talking through a camera to you guys and gals out there, but we are here together. You are in your room, I am in this room. That's the real world, not I am a citizen and so forth and so on. The mental concept that is okay if it's seen as a provisional way of talking about our history and life, and we understand that, but not okay if it masks the true reality, which is our here-ness together. That's what we need to illuminate. That's what I'm about to talk about in the book. The vast majority of philosophy, political theory, social theory, economics, social change thinking, and most important, common sense, participates in seeing and thinking about the world, starting unconsciously from the withdrawn stance, and then constructing mental concepts which are superimposed on the world and taken as accurate descriptions of the way things are. If I say, I'm a citizen of the United States, and that's the way things actually are, no, that isn't what the way things actually are. Is I'm here in the room with you. You're here in the room with me. Here we are. We are here together, co-present to each other. We are not out there in the United States. Okay. Because of the reified, which really means fact-like, because of the reified or fixed, because of the reified, grid-like nature of these conceptually signified images, and because they emerge from the fear-generated presupposition of our separation, they prevent us from becoming conscious of the inherently already connected existential life world that grounds social reality in lived experience, and that, when seen clearly, illuminates the possibility of a loving transformation of the psycho-spiritual field that is our real life. If we can see it, experience the longing present in rooms here together right now, if we can sense that and feel it and begin to illuminate that, the possibility of breaking through to the creation of a world in which we are truly together, can truly, fully embrace each other's vulnerability and humanity, becomes visible to us. But it's not visible to us if we're lost thinking I'm an individual and that's the way the society is. I'm a citizen of the United States. That way of thinking isn't allowing us to see what's here present in the room. So we're going to bring everything down to exactly what's here present in the room, in the book. This insight first came to me as I was being drawn in to the social movements of the 1960s, most of which for me happened in the early to mid-70s. Because the experience of movement and the experience of being drawn into the movement itself involved a more or less spontaneous reversal of the fear-based stance. A reversal that revealed my otherwise unconscious, largely invisible, prior withdrawn state. The very reason we call these social upsurges movements, as I have written about previously, is that through them we arise from our separation, liberate each other from the psycho-spiritual prison in which we had previously confined each other, and discover through an emergent connection that we are here, present to each other, and are co-creating an existential life world that we had previously been detached from, had been observing and then thinking about from a kind of self-erasing infinite distance. The social movement is actually a movement forward toward the other of each of us, liberating the other through the experience of mutual recognition in a great ricochet. That's what the movement, that's what moves in the movement, that ricochet of recognition. And from an epistemological point of view, this emergence of our collective being engenders a new horizontal perceptual experience in which our prior concepts about the world dissolve, replaced by the actual life world itself. We suddenly experience ourselves as actually existing. The world fills out like a great balloon of horizontal presence and mutuality. And the spiritual radiance that had previously been contained through collective social withdrawal suddenly becomes visible, illuminated. Not to idealize the experience, we have a long way to go still before we can endure this enlivening and enlightening experience of social transformation without internal and social conflict, because our very safety as social beings appears from our fear-saturated conditioning to be as much at stake as our physical bodies are in the presence of a wild animal. But the experience is nevertheless fundamental in its grant of sight. In other words, it's very scary to suddenly discover, whoa, we're all here together co-creating all of reality. There's no there that we're in, that we just go forward in. That's no, we are co-creating it here from our mutual presence, and that's the whole thing. That is actually quite a frightening experience of vulnerability and openness when you discover that, when we discover that. That's what I mean by it's like a little bit like being, like how the fear of your body that occurs in the presence of a wild animal, like, whoa, there's nothing here except what we are co-creating. Through the grace provided by each of us to the other, we can suddenly see the world as it actually is, and as it actually was in our prior state of unconscious separation. As Van Morrison put it in I Forgot That Love Existed, his song, I Forgot That Love Existed, if my heart could do my thinking and my head begin to feel, I would look upon the world anew and know what's truly real. Thus, the proper way to see the world in its social being is as a vast, intersubjective life world of social energy that is either primarily blocked and collectively withdrawn, or unblocked and collectively fully present to each other. This either-or characterization does not do justice to the truth of lived experience, because when we are primarily collectively withdrawn, the fearful impulse is countered at every moment by the pulse of desire moving through it, longing to and actually trying to overcome the withdrawn condition that is spiritually painful and imprisoning. And at the present time of our still limited stage of human evolution or revolution, our still limited stage of human evolution or revolution, when we are more fully present and extended outward in spirit in a greater plenitude of loving connection, we are haunted by the anxiety that our tentative vulnerability will be undermined, that we will each pull the rug out from the other because of the legacy of fear of the other that has been the weight of our inheritance. This is why when we dare to hope, we feel special collective pain when the hope is unrealized. As was the case, for example, after the 2008 election of Barack Obama. But the essential point is that wherever we are in the continuum of mutual presence and the mutual distance of the withdrawn state, We are at all times social through and through. While we exist as distinct presences, we are never actually individuals, to the extent this word implies ontologically distinct and separated entities. In truth, when we criticize the existing world as being too individualistic, what we really mean is that we are existing our social life together in a state of painful mutual withdrawal, in the withdrawn state of peering out from a distance at each other and mediating our connection through conditioned, ungrounded personae or masks, as I will discuss in Chapter 2. Even more, when we say that the problem with our society is that it is too individualistic, we inadvertently participate in the illusion that we are longing to change, because we erase our own social presence in our way of seeing itself. We treat the world as out there and implicitly contrast that too individualistic world with a more socially connected world that would also be out there. To the extent that this out there way of seeing and describing reality silently conveys the erasure of our own presence in the world, we cannot convince people of what we are saying, because the description participates in the very withdrawnness that is what needs to be overcome. There is no world in here and world out there. There is only the withdrawal of mutual presence that we must see and describe, while being present in the world, speaking out from our withdrawn state ourselves, so as to take the risk that others may think that we're incomprehensible or crazy. Our listeners are withdrawn themselves without fully knowing it, and we are trying to reach them and embolden ourselves by seeing and describing and speaking from within the existential social field rather than going along with outside description. Those of you with a background in philosophy may recognize that this perhaps unfamiliar way of speaking and writing that I'm engaging in here has a tradition in philosophy. The phenomenological tradition manifested in the work of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Husserl, and many others, especially Heidegger in Being and Time and Sartre in Being and Nothingness, and R.D. Laing in the field of psychology, all of whom tried to express that we need to recover the truth of our subjective experience in describing being in the world, and stop talking about the world as some kind of entity out there, a thing cut off from being that could be described by a hypothetical observer standing outside of it. Even more, they too made the point that this very mistaken way of seeing is what needs to be described and illuminated in its mistakenness. But all of these writers, also without realizing it, unwittingly wrote from inside the envelope, contrasting the authentic perception they aspired to with the mistaken perception they sought to clarify, as voices from the withdrawn space rather than as voices from the movement looking back at the withdrawn state. Something in their upbringing and later lives, for example, religious community in Kierkegaard's case, induced them to see into the subjective ground of being as lived experience. But they may not have as yet had enough experience of social movement to fully pull themselves out of their detachment. So Sartre, in Being and Nothingness and in his early plays, interposed a Cartesian distance between self and other and self and world that still conveyed the man or woman alone, heroically shouldering his or her freedom and responsibility. And Heidegger, who so keenly saw into the fallen state of what he called the they self of social conformism in Being and Time, catastrophically projected that a kind of superhero authentic being was needed to rescue us from our alienation, which played a role in leading him to Hitler and the Führer principle that he defended in the 1930s as rector of the University of Freiburg. In fairness to Sartre, his later writing in especially the Critique of Dialectical Reason, transcended this unconscious attachment to separation, precisely because of the influence of having plunged into social activism and the movement experience. But that work also retained the tendency toward externalization of the totality, that is, the continuing limitation of Marxism, and that despiritualizes the social field and erases its erotic energy, silently by so doing reaffirming an a priori collective withdrawnness that it was Sartre's main objective to overcome. Thus, for all the contributions these writers have made in illuminating the existential qualities of our lived experience, they still tend to confirm our condition rather than capturing the life world in a way that promotes healing, transformative social action. We must go further out toward each other in our way of seeing and really surrender our separation. We are withdrawn together, looking out at the world, and we must release our erotic longing out toward each other, toward true mutual recognition and affirmation, starting with how we talk about the life world itself. We must let out the leash that we have ourselves on, so that our erotic aspirations to connect with each other in a spirit of love and recognition of each other's present humanity at every moment informs and re-spiritualizes our descriptions of the life world, and in so doing injects a moral dimension into our descriptions themselves, so that listeners or readers who can recognize themselves in our descriptions of the world will at the same time want to change the world, or rather know, perhaps for the first time, that they have always wanted to change it and know in what moral direction to go. Let me give a simple example of such an enriched method of description. A conventional statement about our current world might be, we live in a market system. Please note that this sentence signifies or creates a mental picture of an entity outside of you yourself and me myself that we are in. We live in a market system. And who are we in this sentence? We are also serially separated entities who are clumped together within this other entity, the market system, that exists outside us. If it is a system, it is presumably in motion, but outside us, affecting how we live in it. And what is the nature of this motion? We know the main thing about the market as a system is that it involves competition among economic actors. People who like markets could say that this is a good thing. Those who don't could say it's a bad thing. The description itself is morally neutral. So if we now summarize this barest surface of this short descriptive sentence, we could say that what it communicates is a morally neutral mental picture of an entity outside of us in which we are and live, which we are in and are in some way appended to as it moves around us like a system in some kind of systemic motion. Note how different the description is if we re-spiritualize it, enlivening the description with our own erotic energy. Instead of we live in a market system, we could better say that while we long to authentically connect with each other and to co-create our world in a mutually affirming and co-present way toward bringing into being a meaningful emergent social reality, including the economy if we focus on the material aspect of the market, we have inherited a fearful surrounding environment that leads us to suppress our natural brotherliness and sisterliness toward instead using each other to maximize our money to mediate and sustain our separation, even as we still seek in small ways at every moment to transcend that spiritual distance in informal ways. Our need for food and shelters to sustain our physical bodies and keep up the vitality of our life force does exert a profound pressure in support of the legacy of fear that separates us. And this blend of material need and fear of each other leads us to participate against our will and with varying levels of intensity in co-creating this spiritually painful state of affairs. As we grow, make, and distribute material goods to each other, even as we continue to try to connect in many, many small ways in spite of that. This latter description is just another way of saying we live in a market system. But it spiritualizes the description by restoring to it its existential human quality, and by linking the spirit of the describer and the description to the spirit of the thing being described. Instead of presenting the world as a kind of mechanism in motion outside of the describer, and therefore outside of all of us, since the validity of the statement by the describer depends upon our identification with it as valid, my latter description recasts this same world in a way that restores its lived spiritual erotic quality. Here is the critical point. When I, as the perceiver and describer of the social reality, release myself into it, when I let out the leash on myself and release myself from my die stance and self-erasure, and by so doing join the world of my own description, I also at the same time release the listener or reader from the withdrawnness that he or she is longing to be released from. When we perceive and then describe the world, we take a stand on how it actually is and implicitly bring the force of this descriptive truth claim to bear on the listener, silently confirming his or her withdrawn condition, or on the other hand, affirming his or her erotic aspiration to transcend that condition. If the market system example is an example of an economic narrative, we can now return to the mini-political narrative I presented earlier about citizens and the state to more easily see how the same descriptive force works on us in the political sphere, in the mental space we call political thought. In its opening sentence on the topic, Wikipedia presents the following description of democracy. Democracy is a form of government in which all eligible citizens are meant to participate equally, either directly or through elected representatives indirectly, in the proposal, development, and establishment of the laws by which their society is run. We can now see that this way of seeing, so to speak, instantly despiritualizes the intersubjective life world by offering a description of disconnected citizens somehow getting together equally, meaning in an additive fashion that includes each citizen entity, to make an entity separate from them called society run. If we contrast that with my sentient longing to connect with the person next to me, to overcome my alienation in a mysteriously inherited world of reciprocally enforced isolation, and to come into a communion of empathy while engaging in common cooperative meaningful activity, we can see that the Wikipedia description presents a mental picture of the intersubjective life world that consigns me and you to solitude in perpetuity by designating us, through the signifying power of mental concepts, as ontologically separated figures inside some larger entity called society that we together make run. So we're out, if we live in a democracy, that's how our society is run, we are participating in a whole mode of description that masks our present here-ness and hurls it out into this mental space in which we are added up as separated citizens to make our society and entity run, all outside of our real existence, which is here with each other, in relation to each other. So, on the other hand, if we re-spiritualize democracy, if we seek to re-describe it, beginning with the illumination of ourselves as socially connected spiritual beings, seeking each other's recognition and affirmation, we can understand that the realization of the idea of government by the people requires the transcendence of our mutual alienation or solitude or withdrawnness or separation, so that a people can actually come into existence, and in so doing become a together that can shape a world. To have democracy, we must emerge into the connection of mutual presence through gatherings that foster empathy, mutual understanding, and dialogue, with the intention of collectively becoming present to shape our life world. This is quite a difference from the citizen units in the Wikipedia's version of democracy, slogging out to touch a computer screen on one day a year, the first Tuesday in November. So we go out on the first Tuesday in November and we touch the screen to make our society run democratically. That is so far short of what's needed for the democracy of mutual interconnectedness and interbeing to emerge into the world. So to say that our new way of seeing and knowing involves a re-spiritualization of the social world will likely raise at least two red flags among readers committed to the liberation of humanity from injustice, suffering, and oppression. First, you may be put off by the very idea of spirituality or of re-spiritualizing, first social interpretation and then social activism, because the word spirituality is associated with either religion, which you do not believe in or think of as an opiate that distracts people from the injustices of the real world, or as New Age beliefs and practices that you believe involve pursuing private, quasi-mystical fantasies of transcendence that also involve a denial of reality as it actually is. At the core of these concerns is a conviction that spirituality is both false in the sense of being made up and not really referring to anything real, and also a denial of the reality of economic inequality and power relations in the really existed, empirically visible world. To the extent that spirituality can be guilty of these charges, I would ask you in reading this book to suspend these concerns, at least temporarily, because I am not using the term in either the religious sense or the New Age privatized sense. Though I should say I am drawn to what I consider the best and most binding together again, or religious, elements of religion and other spiritual practice. When I speak of re-spiritualizing the world, what I mean is simply that we human beings are bound together by spirit, that there is a vibrant life force that unites us and that is social in nature, although invisible to the naked, objectifying eye. And more, that the longings of this social spirit are at the core of our search for meaning in life and are at the core of all human motivation in the realm of economics, politics, psychology, personal life, everything. There are, to be sure, objective material motivations in life having to do with survival and well-being of the physical body, the need for food, clothing, and shelter. But I am saying that there is a social, spiritual aspect of life that is at the heart of the meaning of our social existence. reincorporating that into the way we describe what is occurring in our social existence, is what I mean by the need to re-spiritualize our way of seeing and knowing and speaking about that existence. If you like, and if it helps, the emphasis is on spirit rather than spirituality. I'm trying to illuminate the radiant texture of psycho-spiritual meanings, the previously, for the most part, invisible longings of the heart, channeled into our intersubjective intentions and actions that are at the heart of what Sartre calls le vécu, the lived. My use of the term has nothing to do with religion or spiritual practices as such. The second red flag that some may see in my emphasis on re-spiritualizing the way we see things is the concern that I am emphasizing the inner at the expense of the outer, that there is a real struggle going on in the world between, for example, the owners of capital and workers who can only survive by selling their labor power to these capital owners, and that my approach minimizes the importance of this kind of real struggle that many on the left see as underlying the psycho-spiritual factors that I emphasize. In response to this, let me say at the outset that my interest is in showing not that this material struggle does not exist or is not important, but rather that it is itself an expression of a psycho-spiritual alienation that underlies it rather than the converse. Thus, I will attempt to describe the hierarchies of the capitalist workplace as socially cemented manifestations of social fear, and show how this fear is actually spread through and reinforced within the hierarchy of classes, and within hierarchies as a whole. In this way of seeing the same reality that the Marxist sees, I wish to show that the owner of capital is caught up in and has internalized a social network characterized by fear of the other, meaning not particularly fear of the worker, but fear of everyone, his wife, his children, the person next to him, that makes it difficult for him to see that sharing his resources in seeking to create a more loving community is his actual salvation. I will be trying to show in my descriptions that it is this network of social fear that motivates him to be an economic oppressor, that shapes the pretensions of his character, and that isolates him in a silent social paranoia that leads him to see the worker mainly as a mere factor of production, that makes him mostly indifferent to, or really blocked against recognizing the humanity of others. Therefore, although my descriptions advocate a re-spiritualization of how we perceive and understand the world, they are just as social and political in nature as Marxist descriptions, in the sense that only social action and effort, including struggle against strong resistance, will transform the social reality. It is true that the implications of my psycho-spiritual emphasis point to more diverse opportunities for transformative action than ways of seeing requiring contradictions of economic interest to generate collective agency. Because in my way of seeing, the longing for human connection at all times coexists with and transcends the fear that contains it. Thus, rather than being restricted to a materially based concept of class struggle, the opportunities for transformation exist at all points in the social context where love and hope can emerge through the blend of spiritual anxiety and material fear that maintains the inertia of existing life patterns. And in fact, coming to see the existence of these opportunities and coming to understand how to organize through and against the network of social fear is a purpose of this book. But although the terrain that I emphasize is the spiritual dimension of our common existence, the approach to social change I am offering remains a social political approach and is equally opposed with Marxism and other related traditions on the left to the idea that social change can result from a private transformation of consciousness in socially separated persons. Though such so-called personal efforts, which turn out on investigation to also be social, insofar as they always require a liberating internalization of another human being, these also have their place. This spiritualization of socio-political analysis of class and other hierarchical dynamics in the present moment also indicates that we must shift our way of understanding historical dynamics. One of the most compelling features of the Marxist analysis of society has been and continues to be its understanding of history. In fact, most people on the left were at one time drawn to Marx by a common experience of revelation. We are born inside capitalist culture and therefore initially internalize the common sense and ideology of the system, including its individualism, its message that we are all free and equal, that each of us succeeds according to our own merit, that we live in a democracy where we the people decide, and that therefore the world is as it should be, or will be eventually as we move forward in collective liberty. But then this internalized common sense and ideology comes into contradiction with some aspect or aspects of our real experience, as pain and suffering and injustice, witnessed in others but also experienced in ourselves, become evident to us in a way that does not appear justified by the justifying common sense and ideology. And then one encounters Marx and the Marxist tradition, and suddenly the contradiction seems resolved, at least in thought. The common sense and ideology was a mask. Underlying socioeconomic forces are exposed as what was and is real, with great detail and intricacy of historical analysis. I myself remember the moment in my early 20s when I, as a second-year law student in the library, first read The German Ideology by Marx and Engels, and felt the blinds were being lifted from my eyes as I read their compelling historical description of the rise and fall of class societies. And yet this experience of revelation may have been misleading, precisely to the degree that it was and remains persuasive. I recently watched a television drama on the Wars of the Roses called The White Queen, which presented the struggle for royal power in the 15th century between the Yorks and the Lancasters as simply the result of vicious infighting between two families in which to be king was the self-evident sole objective of the warring sides. There are many ways to understand the description of social reality in television presentation like this, including the appeal in the present day of a symbolic, fear-saturated and rage-filled melodrama as ideology that legitimates our current social world by suggesting that this is how human beings simply are in their being, but also suggesting that we have surpassed in our enlightened liberal democracy this kind of primitive monarchical governance by interfamilial bloodbath. But one thing that was clear to me and my partner Lisa was that the rest of England and the wider world were part of the superstructural battle over the state that we were witnessing. So in pursuit of a quick education in what might have been really going on, we went to counterfire.org's Marxist History of the World, Part 34, which briefly and convincingly analyzed the underlying factors behind the Wars of the Roses, the stage they represented in the struggle of the landed gentry and rising bourgeois class against the feudal lords that characterized this historical period known as market feudalism, the shift of consciousness toward absolutist monarchy and national identity that mediated the conflict in productive forces, the role of new inventions and new legal forms facilitating the rise of urban crafts industrial enterprise, long-distance trade, and money lending. New forms of military bombardment also under royal control. According to this narrative, these were the complex underlying economic and social forces shaping the civil wars among royal families, with contesting socioeconomic groups backing one or the other of the contestants for the crown, based upon their respective economic interests across a period of a few hundred years prior to the ultimate defeat of feudalism and victory of the capitalist class. When I say that this Marxist description of the television show's events is convincing, I mean that it is so far superior in practical detail and narrative plausibility to the show's version of reality as a war among a dozen or so royal family members that one would naturally be inclined to say, of course, this is what was really going on, or something like it. But the Marxist description presents in a completely unproblematic way what it means to say someone is or was a feudal lord, or a member of the landed gentry, or any of the other roles in the description, and even more, it covertly envelops these social roles in a story that places the engine moving the roles forward in historical time in the economy. The struggle, therefore, of socio-role-based economic underlying material motivation forces. The explanatory power of the Marxist interpretation results from the reification of the socio-economic narrative as a totality, which the writer presents as objective observation from outside the events themselves. But as I will show, a feudal lord is not a flat entity-like designation of an identity, but is rather an evocation of an alienated manifestation of social being, longing to transcend its alienation and afraid of doing so. A re-spiritualized way of seeing the same phenomena described by the Marxist historian requires that we get inside the existential life world of the feudal lord, that we grasp him in his style, pretense, and effortful authority, that we show why he might anxiously be shifting an imaginary allegiance as an isolated, fearful being from the family and its coat of arms to being English during this period of the rise of a unified nationalistic imaginary, that we feel his erotic ties to a sadomasochistic relationship to his vassals whom he protects, and how this may protect him from becoming vulnerable to their true humanity. And I will show how the same alteration of social being inflects the other actors in the historical dynamic: the landed gentry, the rising class of merchants, the king himself, insofar as these historical actors give themselves over to being roles in an intergroup fear-saturated struggle. My intent is not to reject the Marxist socio-economic elements in the situation, but to show we can engage in this enlivened description of the existential life world of social being as it was lived at a particular time, while acknowledging the proper weight and influence of the fear of starvation and scarcity, the need to maintain control over land and crops, and other survival needs of one's own body and other bodies with whom one is identified. In other words, if we can re-spiritualize the psycho-spiritual field of the present moment that we ourselves live in, we must also accomplish this in trying to recover the existential life world of those who preceded us in precisely the same way, to conserve the Marxist attention to the empirical detail of historical reality, while also going inside these details to restore to them their social spiritual heart or core or foundation. How do I know that the approach I am proposing to the feudal lord is truer to the reality of the feudal lord than the Marxist approach? My answer to that question must be addressed to you, dear reader, as simply an appeal. The method that this book flows from is to begin from inside myself and to call upon you to respond from inside yourself, to let go of your holding back and looking at things from a distance, and instead throw yourselves forward into the world so as to illuminate it with the light of your own existence. The Marxist, like the liberal who posits that we are all free and equal citizens, free and equal individuals, withdraws him or herself from the vortex of life and writes and speaks about the world as seen from the outside. The next great shift in consciousness, in theory and practice, in perceiving, thinking through, and acting on our situation, requires that we re-spiritualize all of these ways of seeing and thinking so that we, A, surrender our detachment, B, connect the heart and the head, C, describe the world from the inside by throwing ourselves forward via an intuitively based description into the inside of the life world itself, and D, because the life world is inherently social, make visible its interior social distortions in such a way as to point the listener or reader toward a healing redemption of our longing to live in a loving and authentically connected community. To accomplish this evolution of our way of seeing and thinking and speaking of our life world, we must begin by clarifying what it is that has gotten so distorted, a distortion that keeps reproducing itself generation after generation.